start to vibrate more, and they cease to be able to interact in the way that we want them to interact, isolated from the rest of physical reality inside the quantum computer. But we don't seem to have a way of getting around the fact that particles simply are going to vibrate at higher temperatures, and so we need to have these lower temperatures. I don't know if IBM has a different approach, but as I was saying before, it's University of New South Wales seems to be trialling just using liquid helium. Now, having liquid helium in your house, I mean, it's not a physical barrier. People could technically, I suppose, do that. But at the moment, it seems to be in the state that superconductivity is. Superconductivity would be a wonderful way in order to transmit electricity at extremely low, like zero resistance, but extremely low energy loss. But we're still not able to have superconductors that are anything like room temperature. It's not like there's a physical law that says that it's not possible, but no one's been able to solve that engineering problem. Are we sort of in the same stage when it comes to quantum computation systems as well, in the same way that we are with superconductivity?
Yes, I mean, I make two comments there, I think. So we do have room temperature superconductors. They just require like ginormous amounts of pressure to maintain that, so it's still not anywhere near energy efficient. And then there are temperature is, depending on what type of quantum architecture you're working with, is not necessarily, so there are photonic based quantum computers being researched or developed. Temperature is not much of a problem when you're talking about photons, because photons generally aren't going to be interacting much with the environment. The harder part there is finding ways to make the photons actually interact with each other, because you generally have to mediate that through some sort of matter. Trapped ions can also operate at room temperatures. They aren't required to be in vacuum or chilled. The operations do get a little bit better as you go down, but the initial trapped ions, I don't believe were cooled near absolute zero.
So I'm
really architecture.
I'm gonna push the conversation one level higher, because I think we're losing most of our audience. We've definitely left me behind. I know Paul is keeping up. I know he's furiously scribbling notes and has done some equations. Paul, you've made some progress, I hope, in this field. He's
fine.
bent over.
I'm doing fine.
Okay, he's doing great. Okay, Paul's keeping up, so I'm falling behind, and it's late, and that's kind of in the title. So I'm going to keep the conversation at one level higher. Jeffrey, thanks for coming in. It's great to have an expert. This is the magic of Clubhouse.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, see, it's like there's an old rule on the internet where if you want to ask a question, then don't ask the question, just give the wrong answer, and you will immediately be corrected by the internet. So all we have to do to get the right answer in quantum computing is give the wrong answer, and then the quantum researcher who happens to be in the audience will, of course, leap up and say, hey, wait a minute. And so that was great. So related to this, like Deutsch talks about this in his book, In the Beginning of Infinity. He talks about the idea that you can know everything. And not only is it likely, but it's becoming more likely with time, because our theories, that our best theories, are becoming deeper and deeper with their explanations. Or as Richard Feynman said, like, nature uses the longest threads to weave her tapestry. So we're just figuring out better and better how to understand everything, and not to memorize everything, not to memorize all the little details in the minutiae, but to have the understanding of more and more broad topics at a high level. So he mentions four grounding theories that are like the most important, that sort of cover the largest field. And if I can remember them correctly, I believe it's epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, or knowledge creation, which he talks about a lot with Karl Popper's work. It's the theory of evolution, popularized by or discovered by Charles Darwin and then improved subsequently. It's the quantum theory, which includes relativity, I think, as a subset. And it is the theory of computation, which sort of takes front and center with Deutsch coming up with the quantum computer, which can then efficiently replicate every physical process. What's missing? What else is there? So Brett, you've read a lot of Deutsch. What about the complexity theory? The whole concept of emergence and chaos and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and non-reductive reasoning. What about relativity? Should it be its own separate thing broken out in there? Is there really nothing else that is that fundamental? It feels like there should be a couple more explanatory theories in there. And if these four are correct, then what's next? What's the missing one? What's the next one that we should be working on, or is that not even knowable?
So I'll come at that from a few directions. Firstly, the claim that we can know everything, and I think this is true. What we mean by this is that we can come to understand everything that is known. It doesn't mean that we will know everything that is possible into the distant, infinite future that can never be known. After all, we might potentially not be around for the infinite future. So there will be things yet to be known that we don't know today, that we don't understand.
I see. But
today.
of the things that we do know, that
Yes.
one person can understand all the deep explanatory theories behind all the things that we do know.
Yes. So you mentioned complexity theory, you mentioned other areas of inquiry. Perhaps you might even throw in there something like philosophical knowledge, moral knowledge, political knowledge, the idea about how best to run a society. These don't appear at first glance to be in the four that you mentioned, but I suppose they come together if we start to talk about people and what people are. And that falls under all of those different domains. And then when you have the products of people's creative output, you then begin to explain what it is that people are doing. And if I could just mention how the fact that people don't appear in those four, it doesn't seem as though when you list epistemology, the theory of evolution by natural selection, the theory of
evolution feels the
computation.
closest. Yeah,
it feels the closest. But in fact,
at least evolution for their physical and epistemology for their mental.
Yes, so I would say in fact that people don't need to evolve. And computation. It's the nexus between computation and epistemology where really a person emerges from that. And when we speak about people, we don't just mean human beings. We mean the potential of alien life. We mean the potential of AGI as well. These will be people. And what a person is a special kind of computer. Now, we haven't been able to program computers yet. We don't know what the software is. We don't know what the algorithm would be for an artificial general intelligence. An artificial general intelligence would have to have a way of creating knowledge. And of course, that's the domain of epistemology. That's what Karl Popper tried to explain, tried to come up with a broad brushstroke about what the best explanation of how we generate explanations is. And that is by this method of conjecture and refutation. Now, we understand pretty well about how to refute bad ideas, to refine the best ideas we have to make them better, but we don't really have a clue about how we create ideas. And many of the great thinkers over the years have reflected upon their own ability to come up with interesting creative ideas, and they haven't really had good answers beyond kind of bromides about, well, I'm creative, or I'm imaginative, or I'm more curious, or I'm just more dedicated.
Yeah, or Steve Jobs actually famously said creativity is just connecting things, like putting things together. But it's obviously not that simple, because it's connecting in some way where you at least have some chance of the connection working. So you've still pulled that, you've pulled into a range of potentially correct answers out of an infinite pool of noise.
Yes.
So there's something going on in creativity that we don't understand, and this is probably what stymies AGI research.
Yes.
Which is, if we can't program creativity, you can't program the thing that makes us fundamentally unique. But going back to one thing, we glossed over this idea of universal explainer, and I think it's or universal computer, and I think it's an interesting one. I don't think most people know this, but in the theory of computation and in the theory of knowledge, you can show that anything that a computer could ever possibly understand, anything that an AGI could ever possibly understand, a human being is also capable of understanding. Like, we are universal explainers, we're universal computers. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. And it means that for any physical phenomena that exists out there, for example, a quasar, for example, a black hole on the other side of the universe, we humans uniquely can generate an explanatory and predictive model within our own minds, which is a phenomenal claim. Now, normal classical computers, of course, they're not thinking, they're not creating anything new. We have to program them, but we can program them such that they will contain within their circuitry, within the software, an accurate working predictive model of anything else that we can observe. Anything that we can observe within the observable universe, from the smallest particle through to the largest structures in the universe, we can generate models of these things, explanations of these things. And this is the universal part of our mind. Not only does it mean that anything that anyone else understands, no matter who the genius is, but if you focus your own mind on that, you can also replicate their model, their explanation inside your own mind. But more than that, any physical system that exists in the universe, in principle, will have a set of laws governing it, and that set of laws can be learned by a person, and therefore can be explained by a person. So this is a remarkable fact about human beings. They are a certain kind of computer running a certain kind of software. We don't know precisely what the software is. All we can say is that the outputs of that software are unpredictable and creative.
Shaun, welcome.
Thank you. I think Paul invited me because I'm a mathematician. I used to teach math at MIT, and I in fact worked on some superstring theory stuff. And then I got just disillusioned with that whole program and switched to taking a mathematical look at human cognition. So I've been building useful models of human cognition, where a useful model, instead of some kind of academic plaything that you can write papers about, would be a model that you can use to build something powerful and measure the power of it in the real world.
So how far are we from an AGI?
I don't know, and I don't care, because human potential, I think, is the biggest under-recognized and massively under-tapped resource. Individual and then collective problem solving is just immense. And we see in like Silicon Valley startups where people create kind of optimal conditions, or in Bell Labs or other situations, what unbelievable kind of explosions you can create, but they happen by accident. And all of the kind of forces of power hierarchies and so on kind of work against those optimal conditions. A big thing that we actually need to learn how to do better as a society, and that I'm working towards, is making those conditions much more easily understandable and creatable.
Why do you think there have been no, sorry to interrupt, Brett. Why do you think there have been no great scientific breakthroughs in the last few decades?
I think, okay, we spent a bunch of time studying small breakthroughs inside software companies. We spent the last 5 years, I have a co-researcher who I met at Oxford who did philosophy and economics, and then who also did design. And those are two kind of important ingredients, because designers understand process in a way that scientists do not. We spent 5 years inside unicorns in Silicon Valley studying small breakthroughs. And we discovered that people who have ideas often don't know how valuable the idea is that they've got. The idea is not a fully formed idea that is provably valuable. It's just kind of a sense that looking in a certain direction is going to be powerful. And what usually happens is that everyone around them, but most importantly, people in charge of them, tend to squash the ideas. And that's just the case everywhere. I mean, look at this conversation between Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt about like Google's innovativeness. And so if you look at a history of discoveries, the Wright brothers, the discovery of penicillin, the Semmelweis and John Snow, what you see is not a history of breakthroughs, but a history of impediments. And so, 1847, Semmelweis discovers what washing your hands in chlorine and lime does. He gets fired from the Vienna General Hospital, and his work is just dismissed and derogated. John Snow figures out what's causing the cholera epidemic. His work is kind of ignored and dismissed. It takes 40 years for Robert Koch to finally put together a way of demonstrating and explaining things in such a way that these ideas won't be summarily dismissed.
So in that case, as we get more and more into peer review culture in science, and we get more into group work and kind of hierarchical institutions driving scientific research, wouldn't that exacerbate the problem?
Yep, exactly. And that's exactly what you see. All of this kind of science research shows that, as the funders get older, they reject the more interesting discoveries that subsequently were demonstrated to be the valuable ones. Everyone feels this, like the young postdocs know that the ideas that feel to them to be the most powerful and important, they don't get to do because it's too risky. So
Yeah, I think the average age of like the recipient of a grant, the lead researcher who gets the grant, has climbed a lot. It's gone from like low 30s to high 40s
yeah,
in the past few decades,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Silicon Valley is the place that's bucked the trend. But
right? It
unfortunately,
goes
Silicon
younger and
Valley,
younger.
yeah, it only gives us a certain domain of exploration and a certain kind of
Yeah, it
discovery.
only wants things that are commercializable within a couple of years. And now we're looking further and further out thanks to people like Elon Musk and Founders Fund and just successes and longer range ideas. But it's definitely still the case that time to market and return on investment all really came out of academic groups and labs, and how many came out of like lone inventors, the so-called natural philosophers. I don't really know what that breakdown is like, but
Or
it
it's
would be an
massive.
interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, the lone inventor, but or the collection of inventors, the Curies. I mean, the pair of people who know how to think really well together and who check each other's blind spots, ask each other hard questions, but in a generous and curious way. That is a real
The
sweet spot.
untapped potential of human creativity, what you were saying, the way you started, what you were saying, and this idea of AGI, there seems to be a tension between people like yourself who talk about the untapped potential of human creativity and other people who seem to think it not a particularly grand thing, not a particularly central or important thing. What they talk about is things like, and I won't mention names, but we can think of prominent neuroscientists turned podcasters who speak about things like AI gradually becoming better at us at everything. So they'll talk about how, well, already the AI is better than us at chess. Already the AI might be better at us at driving. All you need to do on this view is just keep iterating for every task we know of, and then extrapolate out from this list of tasks the AI is getting better at to every other task that a human's able to do, and therefore you'll have a super intelligent AI which is able to be better at us than at everything. But of course that AI will always and only ever have a finite repertoire of tasks that it's able to be good at. It will never be able to creatively think of a new task, and this is why the potential of human beings will always be untapped. It will always be required that no matter how many AIs you have, no matter how smart these AIs are, no matter how general they become, unless they become universal, unless they're actually able to think creatively like a person and therefore be a person, it's not like we're going to run out of jobs. It's not like people are going to be unemployed because the AI are taking the drudgery office. We want the AI to take the drudgery office so that we are left, the rest of us are left to be free to be creative.
Yeah, the closest fun analogy I can think of to this is Siri or Alexa, where they can do a very limited set of tasks, and then some programmer adds another task for them to do, then another task for them to do. And obviously that thing is not intelligent and it's not capable of handling some arbitrary task that you come up with. And in fact, you end up playing this guessing game of like, is this in Alexa's repertoire or not? Am I saying this the right way for Siri or not? But even the AGI, like even if you're to expand that out, your point is like it would have to be so general, it would have to be universal. And if the AGI becomes universal, then it's actually at the same sort of level. It can do the same kinds of explanations that we can do, and
It will
hopefully
be
could
a person,
augment our
yes.
intelligence. It would be a person essentially. It would be a person with maybe a different data input and output mechanism and different rates of taking data in and out. And then we can get into all kinds of like, what is this motive, right? But I would think that something that is that intelligent would also be wise, and something that is
Yes.
that wise would realize that the limiting factor in the universe is knowledge. There's unlimited resources. It's just, do you have the knowledge to do what you want to do with the resource or not, to make use of it? And what an AI would want to do, if it was truly hyper intelligent, like a human being, and a full universal explainer, it couldn't, by the way, bootstrap itself into some form of intelligence that we just are incapable of. That's not what would happen. Yes, it could take in lots of data, but it couldn't just come up with ideas that we couldn't understand and develop technologies that we would not be able to understand. Instead, I would posit that any truly intelligent creature realizes that the scarce resource is knowledge. So it would want to trade with us. It would want us to be as knowledgeable and creative as possible to create knowledge for it to then also consume. And basically, a thought partner, to Shaun's point, right? Big breakthroughs come through short partners. A smart AI that wanted to get smarter would hopefully be curious and generous in a way that it can grow with us. Same reason why I don't think, like, I don't buy the dark forest hypothesis, with all due respect to Brian. I don't think alien civilizations will destroy each other on first sight. They'll trade for knowledge.
Yeah, and an AI, the first AGI, when it's created, when it's programmed, will be brought up in our culture. So it'll be brought up with our moral norms. Whatever our values happen to be, it will be brought up with those. And insofar as a programmer can actually program in certain values, if it's a true AGI, it will be able to change those values, improve those values in light of its own experiences and ideas. Now, we actually consider AGI to be literally people. It's just they might have a different physical instantiation. Instead of being made out of wetware, they're going to be made out of silicon. But every baby that's born is a new form of art, well, not artificial, it's a new form of intelligence. But the only difference between the baby that's been born and the AGI that's being born is the physical kind of hardware that it's running on. In theory, the program, the software that it will have, will be equivalent at a fundamental level. In both cases, it will be about creating explanations, creating knowledge, because that's the fundamental nature of a person, whether they be AGI, alien from the other side of the galaxy, or even us. We're all equivalent in that way. And that's why David Deutsch says there's one kind of person.
And it's the one reason to be optimistic about the world is that every new child is essentially a lottery ticket for humanity on the next Einstein or the next Bohr or Fermi, or someone who can create a breakthrough that will benefit all of humanity. Because ideas and the output from ideas in an interconnected world are nonlinear. One person can literally improve the standard of living or the health and well-being for everybody. One person who's born tomorrow might figure out how to get us all to immortality or to gene therapy or to beating cancer or to building lighter weight rockets or all kinds of things. So every single person who is born, if we can help them get to their maximum creativity, can actually create abundance for everybody. And that's sort of the way out of the classic Malthusian trap. The Malthusian trap was that we're going to grow so much so that we all consume the resources. But instead, what we always do is we grow our knowledge. And by growing our knowledge, we change the definition of what resources are. And we actually increase the resources available to us faster than we consume them.
Yeah, and obviously the historical fact is that as the population of the planet has increased, so has the standard of living, inexorably, and for everyone. So every time you get modern Malthusians who say we need to stop the population at X level, we need to prevent cities from getting too large, and so on and so forth. What we've found is that over the centuries this has been going on, things have nevertheless gotten better. We've found cures to disease. We've found ways to support people on ever smaller pockets of land. We've found ways to feed more people using less resources over time per unit person. So there's every reason to be optimistic. Not even every reason. There's every good explanation we have about what it takes in order to support more people. It tells us that the amount of people on the planet is nowhere near its maximum limit. And in fact, of course, we don't have a limit. We're not limited to the planet. Eventually we'll be able to move out from here and occupy the rest of intergalactic space.
Yeah, to some extent, we're already living in a biosphere. I mean, the carrying capacity of the Earth as hunter-gatherers is probably like 5 million people or thereabouts. We're already living in a very artificial environment that we've created for ourselves. Now, obviously, the challenge here is to do that in such a way that we actually survive long enough on this planet to either terraform it or to create the next one. But, so far it hasn't been so bad.
I'd like to reorient the emphasis a bit, rather than thinking about, when we look in the rearview mirror at history, we look at Einstein and Fleming and John Snow and Pasteur as these amazing discoverers or inventors. I happen to think that there's just a continuum between what we like to talk about as discovery versus invention, and they're really all part of the same thing. And so we think, oh, there's these rare people, and we use the label geniuses. But actually, a lot of the research on what people can learn suggests that the people aren't rare, it's the conditions in which they got to maybe obsessively acquire skill that are rare. And in fact, when you look at those conditions, they're incredibly rare. And often certain people who kind of end up looking like they were obsessive about certain things, they in fact had mentors, and they obsessively created the conditions in which they could continue to learn. So it was a kind of a virtuous cycle. And so what we actually need is to create rare conditions. And then rather than thinking about knowledge, think about tools that people with incredible amounts of skill that they've grown can use. Because, you know, what did Einstein need to do? He needed to forget the knowledge of his forebears and look afresh at the Michelson-Morley experiment, and then be good at using some mathematical tools, and then invent a new model to explain the data. Or, you know,
Which one was Michelson-Morley? Was that the light bending around the star? The starlight
no,
bending
that
around the
was
sun? No,
that was the
no, that was
failed
that was a crucial test.
Yeah, that was the
Right.
failed experiment to measure the rate at which the luminiferous ether, which was thought to be the
Oh, right,
substrate
right,
through
moving
which
against
light
the
passed.
background. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
yeah,
space is empty problem. Yeah, is there a
yeah.
background or is space empty? Yeah.
Yeah, so everyone else said, you know, oh, the experiment just wasn't accurate enough, so they classified it as just a failed experiment. And
Right. So Michelson-Morley was basically the belief was that there's a luminiferous ether
yes,
against which everything moves. It is a
yes,
background, and
yes,
so that's how everything like time and gravity sync up in different places.
yes,
And so they're supposed to measure the rate of movement against the background. They just couldn't find it, and
yes,
so they thought the experiment was wrong. It was broken, and
yeah,
it actually turns out there is no ether. Everything is relative to everything else, and that was Einstein's breakthrough.
yes. Yeah, and so you know, he had to dismiss this so-called knowledge, and you know, the physicists of the day were unable to dismiss that knowledge. I mean, that's the other kind of really interesting point here about you know, it's how you think about some of what's available, and then how you decide that, you know, other stuff, kind of, you know, other theories that are being talked about in the ether, pun intended, you should in fact forget
Yeah, there's
about.
there are other what other things are hanging out there in physics at loose ends that are just completely unexplained and might be contradictions of this order. Like for example, every time I hear dark matter and dark energy, something in me sort of feels uneasy, as if, well, no, this just feels like we're one big twist away from figuring out what that is. Like something about our current theories really doesn't make sense at all. Some assumption is broken at a core level. Would you characterize those, or are there others that you would point to that are like, hey, these experiments cannot be explained by physics today and may require fundamental rethinking?
Could be. I mean, you know, I dove into cognitive science and started looking at the completely fragmented and you know, ridiculously terrible stuff, way more ingenious and jaw-droppingly beautiful than most physics experiments, buried, and then fragmented because, you know, it's buried in, you know, like there's incredible results on problem-solving situations from the 1950s and results on developmental linguistics of children from Steven Pinker, but they're all just scattered across different disciplines, and these disciplines don't talk to one another. And no one ever set out to try and build a truly unified framework and in which you could interpret all this stuff. And, you know, the evolutionary psychologists, Cosmides and Tooby and certain others, kind of tried to build a unifying picture, but they didn't set as their problem to incorporate and restate all of the solid discoveries from all these other disciplines, and that's what we set out to do. And so there are anomalies galore. I mean, there's just so many stuff, so many kind of data points or hypotheses that you can just, I mean, it's just the most interesting and fantastic playground.
Brett, if you had to point some aspiring young physicists in directions, where would you point them?
Well, I would suggest we begin with Popper's injunction to begin with a problem. And you mentioned two that I'm really fascinated by, which are the dark energy problem and the dark matter problem. I'm interested in cosmology, and so that's where I'd be pointing young physicists to, is anywhere that we don't have an answer, where there's a conflict between observation and our present state of knowledge. This is the history of science. The reason why Einstein came up with general relativity is because there were observations, namely of the orbit of Mercury, number one, but various other problems with the way in which to reconcile electricity and magnetism with special relativity that caused him to come up with general relativity. So he began with a problem. Darwin began with a problem. So you know, my knowledge of the problems that are going on in quantum theory now is reasonably limited to things like quantum computation. How can we get a better quantum computer? But for someone who's interested in trying to solve a problem that so far no one has a good answer to at all, I'd be looking at dark matter. I'd certainly be looking at dark matter. I'd certainly be looking at dark energy. Both of these are utterly mysterious. They're names of problems. They're not names of actual entities that we can get a handle on. Dark matter isn't a form of matter. We don't know what it is yet. All we have are observations of various kinds, and recently there's been an attempt to dismiss dark matter. But these dismissals, these attempts at dismissals, are attempts to explain the rotation curves of galaxies. However, rotation curves of galaxies are not the only reason that we think dark matter exists. There's a whole bunch of other observations that we absolutely have, about the motion of entire clusters of galaxies, about certain actual physical observations using telescopes that we have of ionizing radiation. There's all sorts of things that we have that point towards dark matter. And so dismissing one set of observations doesn't solve the rest of them. So I'd be looking at those two.
And those are really important because they're so fundamental that if we were to address them, it might open up a new source of energy, new ways of computation, new technologies. Just like, you know, without relativity, we couldn't put satellites and rockets up. Without quantum mechanics, we wouldn't understand how to build semiconductors at the level that we do today. Obviously, those are just two tiny examples, but those theories have had massive effects on our explanatory power and our ability to build technology. So even one single scientific breakthrough could literally usher in an entire revolution in technology that lasts for decades and decades.
Yeah, the growth of knowledge is inherently unpredictable, as we like to say. There's no knowing what any particular breakthrough is going to lead to. When people talk about, well, we shouldn't be funding fundamental research, why bother funding theoretical physics when there's still people dying of cancer? Why aren't we throwing our money behind the health sciences? Well, who needs physics? Well, the only reason that we have anything from X-ray technology through to magnetic resonance imaging, through to just about anything that you can point to in a hospital that keeps people alive or helps to diagnose disease, in some way had its antecedents in pure theoretical physics and then eventually experimental physics. And it wasn't until much later that someone figured out, oh, this has an application for keeping people alive. And so that's the lesson of history, that we don't just look for trying to figure out all the ways in which there might be spin-offs. What we need to do is go as deep as we possibly can, and then it will absolutely follow, it will always be the case, that technology will come along for the ride eventually. So the most efficient and best way, often, to make the technological breakthroughs that are going to actually transform the world is not to aim for the technology in the first place, is to aim deeper, at a deeper level, a more fundamental level of explanation, to change our explanations, which will then allow us to think of new technologies that wouldn't have been possible to think of in the existing framework, the existing theories that we have.
So I want to talk about another experiment that seems to defy explanation. And I want to do it as a very long-winded way of asking you a question, but I'll get to the real question I'm curious about in a few minutes. But this experiment, which seems to defy explanation, is the famous double slit experiment. And it purports to show that light can be both a particle and a wave. And the conclusion, the naive conclusion, or one conclusion, is to say, well, that's because of the observer, and the observer somehow interferes with the experiment. But of course, you didn't even bring this up as something to research, because in your mind, or according to the explanations you know, this has already been explained, and this has been explained by the multiverse theory. So could you just very briefly talk about particle wave duality and the multiverse and how the multiverse theory resolves it? But let's be relatively succinct, because I actually do have a question I want to get to.
Sure. Well, this particle wave duality thing, this might upset some people who've taken some university physics, is a nonsense way, what I would regard as a nonsense way of trying to avoid the actual answer. What particle wave duality says, it's an equivocation on what's going on in something like the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment, just very quickly, if you fire single particles at a double slit, they will seem to behave like waves. And the equivocation comes with some physics professors who will say something along the lines of, well, sometimes the particle is actually a particle, but sometimes the particle's a wave. And so it just depends on what the experiment is, as if the particle knows what experiment you're going to do from one moment to the next. Now, this is not true. What we say is that particles are particles and they're always particles. Now, what's going on in the double slit experiment is when you fire a single particle that you can observe, there are other particles that accompany this that you cannot easily observe. The only way you know they exist is because there is a multiverse. And this is the explanation. And people balk at this and people think, oh, you're inventing particles that you can't observe. No, you're compelled to accept the existence of these particles in much the same way that we must accept the fact that planets exist on the other side of the galaxy that we cannot hope to observe with our current telescopes. We cannot hope to observe planets orbiting stars in other galaxies. Our technology is just not there. So we always postulate the existence of things in science which we cannot observe. And this is just another case of that. So wave-particle duality, a misconceived way of trying to explain away deep truths about the nature of reality. And that deep truth is, there is a multiplicity of universes, all obeying the same laws, but the universe is just much larger than most people think.
So this gets very complicated. I'm not sure I want to go into this in a late night clubhouse session, but and I probably won't. I would direct you all to The Beginning of Infinity, The Fabric of Reality. These are both books by David Deutsch, and to Brett's podcast, aka Talkcast, where I've been listening to some of this stuff. But here's the part where I'm hung up a little bit, Brett. I'm a little confused, and this is a bit of an advanced topic, so I'll try to simplify it down. But essentially, when you see a particle take a certain path in other universes, it's taking basically every other possible path, but probability weighted distribution. And you don't see it in those other universes. You're only in one universe, so you only see one path. However, in the different universes, the particle can take different paths because of this concept of fungibility, which I don't necessarily want to get into right now, but it's quite complex. But because the particles themselves are fungible in some sense, there are things that can happen that can cause them to take different paths. Yet at the same time, it doesn't seem like there's any basis for probability in the universe. Things are deterministic. Not that you can necessarily predetermine them without a computer of massive, greater complexity, but things are deterministic in that there's no dice being played in the universe. There's no probability going on. It's just if you could peek closely enough, you would be able to tell where the particle would exactly go. So what am I missing? There's a contradiction between this idea of no probability in the universe, and at the same time, I see the photon, for example, take a particular path, and in other universes, which are supposed to be identical universes, it took a different path.
Yeah, so the way we understand probability within a deterministic reality is to say there is a subjective probability. So for you, Naval, and for me, Brett, watching a double slit experiment taking place, we don't know what universe we're in. So there's one chance out of however many times we do the experiment of seeing that particle land on the screen at the place that it does. So there is subjective probability. But as a matter of objectivity, as a matter of actual reality, everything that can happen really does happen with probability 1. So everything just happens according to the laws of physics, according to deterministic laws. What David Deutsch and his collaborators talk about is something known as the decision theoretic argument. And this is too technical, but basically it says you can use probability. It's just that you have to keep in mind that it's a rule of thumb. It doesn't mean that things are really truly probabilistic in some sort of ultimate physical sense. It just means that from the perspective of a person who occupies a particular universe, you're able to make a calculation to say where those particles are going to go. And by the way, we know these other particles in other universes must exist because we can do other experiments. For example, blocking one of the slits in the twin slit experiment. If you block one of the slits in the twin slit experiment, the interference phenomena disappears. The particle goes through a particular path and is unaffected by anything else because no other particle is coming through the other slit. But if you unblock that other slit, something comes through that slit. Some effect is coming through that slit in order to push aside that particle, from taking the path that it otherwise would have. So something's interacting with that particle. And the most parsimonious way of explaining this is other particles are coming through that slit. It's just that you don't observe them except by their interaction with the particle that goes through the slit that you do observe, which is a very simple way of understanding this. Of course, people don't like it, but there's no way of understanding quantum theory that is going to be satisfactory to a person who just wants a common sense understanding. This is the closest we get to common sense. Everything else invokes spooky action at distance, spooky consciousness, something really unusual and weird, or something that simply violates logic. And I have no time for people who want to violate logic, for example, by saying something is both a particle and not a particle simultaneously. I need to preserve the law of the excluded middle.
So if every particle that we observe in these experiments is interacting with a multitude of similar particles on other dimensions, and the probability is just subjective. We're just finding out which universe we're in as opposed to being exposed to actual underlying probability. Then does that mean that everything in our universe is at all times interacting with everything in the multiverse, or its parallel counterpart in the multiverse, in a multitude of multiverses, or sorry, a multitude of universes?
Yeah, so it's not interacting with everything, but it is interacting with, during interference experiments is when we notice the interaction. When decisions are made by conscious creatures, there's also going to be this differentiation between what are known as fungible universes. Now, this gets really deep into the philosophical nature of personhood, and this is the intersection between quantum theory, the nature of personhood,
and free will.
And free will. So, for example, and I know this is hard for people to accept, but this is what the theory tells us, is that right now, as a matter of your experience, you experience being a single person in a single universe. But in fact, what you are is uncountably infinite numbers of identical people. In fact, more than identical, they're fungible. But when a decision is made, some versions of you go off and do something else. If you decide to leave quietly from the clubhouse room, there will be versions of you who remain in the clubhouse room. But you will only, of course, occupy one of these two different universes. But some proportion of copies of you have gone to do something else. And that's just the way it is. An uncountably infinite measure of versions of you have gone to do something else, and an uncountably infinite measure of copies of you have remained doing the thing what you're conscious of doing right now. And that continues to happen every time there's a choice before you. And in fact, more than that, every time there's a quantum choice in the universe, every time a particle could have gone hither or thither, the entire multiverse differentiates. We don't use the word splits because split seems to imply that the universe is somehow physically splitting. What we say instead is that there's this process of differentiation where universes that were completely identical, the word for that is fungible, become different after the quantum interaction.
I love how science gets even, and physics gets even weirder than, say, Buddhism, which says you live many lives. Science says, no, actually you live nearly infinite lives, and they're all
Yes.
here at the same time.
Well, this leads to what, so some people do get very spiritual about this, and they talk about things like quantum immortality. And this, I do not encourage anyone to do this, but the idea of quantum immortality is, let's say that some terrible tragedy happens to you, you decide to perform an experiment where you end your own life. Well, then what happens is that there's going to be some version of you that continues to survive that event, that continues to survive. And so it leads to the idea that in some proportion of universes, you will continue to survive forever. However, what I want to say to that is, yes, some version of you, but that's not necessarily you. That's not the conscious version of you. You
Right.
occupy a particular universe. And although a particular version of you goes on to live forever, that won't be you. That'll be a copy of you, and you will have no conscious experience of that. So don't try the experiment, read about quantum immortality, but keep in mind that although some version of you might go on living forever, that's not you. You will be dead.
So basically, if I keep playing Russian roulette and I keep winning, then I'm in my best universe.
I suppose so, yes, but it becomes vanishingly improbable for you to continue to survive.
Wait a sec, I want to just poke a tiny little provocation into that. It seems like you're saying that some of the versions of you in these multiverses are conscious and other of the versions are not. And I think of consciousness as an epiphenomenon of the computational structure of our brains. And so I'm just wondering, wait, did I miss something?
No, I think they're all conscious. They're all absolutely conscious. It's just that you, of course, are only conscious of your experience. You're not conscious of the copies of you that have different experiences. So they're all equally conscious. I personally don't say it's an epiphenomena. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's an epiphenomena. I like to think that it's just one way of looking at the flip side of free will and creativity. From the inside, we experience consciousness, and I would suggest from the outside, what we see in other people is creativity and free will and unpredictability. So I think there's sort of two sides of the same coin. But all copies of people by definition almost, I would say, are conscious. It comes along for the ride with being a universal explainer.
Now I'm falling back onto my high school or college physics, so this is just being enough knowledge to be dangerous. But I remember something about Feynman path integrals and Feynman diagrams, where basically he was saying that the way to calculate the path that a particle takes is to do the probability weighted average of all the possible paths that it could have taken, and the more ludicrous the path, the less likely it was, the less it counts, and you sort of sum those together. So is
Yes.
that related? Like in a multiverse situation, are you also essentially taking paths through space-time? Every particle is taking paths through space-time, and essentially, instead of this being this virtual calculation that you're doing to figure out the one correct path, you can just break apart the Feynman integral, assume that all those paths were actually taken, and now the distribution is across different multiverses, as opposed to just a probability calculation used to converge in a single universe.
Yes, exactly. A lot of us like to say that Feynman just about got there. He didn't, I don't know if he ever met Hugh Everett or he didn't fully understand Hugh Everett's theory. I don't know if you read Hugh Everett at all, who was the guy we credit with coming up with the multiverse so-called interpretation first. But Feynman's path integrals, these multiple histories, he said they were in theory there. We just go one step further and say, no, they really are there. And not only are those multiple histories really there, but they continue to persist through time off into the infinite future as well. They're really real, and we know they're really real because Feynman himself would have said, well, these theoretical things are affecting these practical things. So the abstract calculation has a real world effect, namely of causing the outcome that we do observe to actually happen. So if something is causing something to happen, then it has a real existence. It doesn't just have a theoretical existence. So I think
Interesting. So Feynman skimmed past the answer, but he was doing it as a calculation expediency or a calculation tool when actually it represented a deeper underlying reality.
yes, I think the history of science is replete with this sort of thing, with many geniuses just about getting there, getting hints of the underlying truth. And I think this is a perfect case of Feynman. Perhaps he wanted to say that these things were real, but he didn't quite have the cojones to actually admit that, because you do sound a bit crazy. Like if you start to say all the possible histories really do exist in some way, well, then you're compelled to go down the philosophical argument of saying, oh, so you know, in the past, Hitler really did win the Second World War. Or in the past, you know, people didn't evolve, and so there is a history where the dinosaurs have continued to survive. Yeah, those things really do exist. Crazy as it sounds, weird as it sounds, but you can either go down that road of simply following the literal interpretation of what the equations are saying, or you can deny the literal equations. But in no other area of science do we do this, by the way. No other area of physics do we say, well, you know, the equations say that as the Earth orbits the sun, it goes through all these different points through the orbit, but we're only going to admit that one point on the orbit exists, namely the one that we observe right now. The one that we're yet to get to, we haven't observed that yet, so it doesn't really exist. And the one that we've already been to, that doesn't really exist. Well, no one is willing to say this about Kepler's laws. All points on the orbit actually exist, even if we don't observe the planet there simultaneously at all of them. So it's only when it comes to quantum theory, to the Schrödinger wave equation and various other equations in quantum theory, do we then say, oh, this equation, it's just a kind of fictional model. It doesn't represent anything real. We need to deny the literal truth of this equation. If it is our best explanation, if it is our best theory, which it is, then we need to take it seriously and to accept the reality that this is a mathematical description of physical reality. And if we take it seriously, this is what we're compelled to believe. Does it mean we can't be mistaken in the future? No, we can be mistaken about anything. We're fallible human beings. But at the moment, if you want the best understanding of quantum theory, of our deepest theory of physics, this is what it's telling us.
So I don't know if you've heard of a related concept called Solomonov induction. Did you ever encounter that in your readings?
No, I've only looked up what it means after you've mentioned it to me a few times.
Yeah, I bring it up because it seems to me like it seems to me to be to knowledge what Feynman path integrals are to particle movement, and it's basically saying that I don't even know how to articulate it well, but the less that goes into the theory, the less moving parts there are, the less assumptions there are, the more likely it is to be correct. And then there's a probability distribution of theories as explanatory for anything that happened, for any effect, um, based on how many assumptions there are. So the naive version of this is Occam's razor, which just says, well, the explanation of the least entities and the least objects is the correct one. But Solomon induction is more of a formalization of that kind of gives you the whole distribution, not just the short form Occam's razor answer. And again, it seems to map to the creation of knowledge, what we've been talking about with particles. Do you think there's a relationship there, or is that just like a funny coincidence?
Personally, I always get uncomfortable with the idea of this or that theory being more likely to be true than another. I think in almost all situations, we're extremely lucky to have an explanation of any given phenomena. So pick gravity. We're very lucky to have an explanation. Call it general relativity. We don't have multiple competing explanations, so we're never in the position of trying to decide between them. It's been a century since we've had a competitor to general relativity, which was Newton's theory of gravity, and we were able to rule out Newton's theory. And so now we're down to one again. In many, many cases, we have identically zero explanations, for example, dark energy. Now, think of any other phenomena. I'm standing in a park right now, I'm looking around at cars. There's identically one theory about how internal combustion engines work as a car goes past. For any phenomena, there's usually one theory, and we call it the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection, the scientific theory of combustion, the scientific theory of quantum theory, so on and so forth. It's very rare for us to be in a position where we need to choose between theories, and when we are in that position, it's not like we assign probabilities. We do an experiment, we do a test, and that test, in the ideal case, will rule out one competitor, and one of them won't be ruled out. Now, that does not mean that that competitor that we have not ruled out, for example, in the case of general relativity, is absolutely certainly true and will stand for all time and cannot possibly be improved. In fact, as fallibilists, we should expect that there will be a competitor who will come along one day and which will be able to do everything that general relativity can do and more. And it's the and more that will then allow us to come up with an experiment to decide between general relativity and the future competitor. That future competitor will probably be something that has a connection to quantum theory, by the way, and this is why, going way back to the beginning of this conversation, it doesn't appear in Deutsch's 4 most fundamental theories, because we expect that quantum theory, once it is united in some way, once we have a quantum theory of gravity, it's that quantum theory of gravity which means that general relativity, in some sense, gravity will just be subsumed into quantum theory. Effectively, it'll be subsumed into the quantum theory of computation, and so then we'll have a unification of gravity, computation, and quantum theory.
Have you looked into Stephen Wolfram's new theory, where he's basically saying that through his experiments with not cellular automata, but sort of like iterated algorithms, that he's been able to deduce that the structure of reality from a bottoms up must then lead to things like quantum theory. But it's like a very computational bottoms up approach. I can't decipher it. I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts on it.
No, I don't. It sounds very interesting. I mean, anything that seeks to begin at the foundations, I'm always fascinated by. It's just whether or not, of course, it leads to any testable predictions, anything that's different to what we currently have. And if it leads to a testable prediction, wonderful, then we can do the experiment. I look forward to being able to do an experiment. Yeah.
No, that is the obvious question. He's got a multi-hundred-page book, and the question is then, so what? So what do you think is real that the current theories do not believe? And what is the experiment that we can set up to test that?
I'd love to direct you to a messy and incredibly frustrating aspect of reality for which there are multiple theories, depending on how you define theory, which is step into a classroom and there's a bunch of school children learning things, and then, go to a conference or a number of conferences or read some books on all the different theories about what's actually happening and therefore what you should do to make it work better. It's just a mess. That's actually what I measure. And I take a different approach where I'm more of an engineer than a scientist, so I don't actually care what's true. I just care what can I build that I can measure the power of. And so I'm more, I guess, on the side of Feynman saying, okay, well, we have a theory, and then we don't need to know what the theory means or whether it's really true. We just need to know, can we use it to build something with?
But it seems like it would be much better to know underlying how the theory works and whether it's true or not, because just prediction is not explanation. Just because I can predict something doesn't mean that I really know how it works and that I can be comfortable and confident that I can predict it in all circumstances or predict what's going to happen when it starts intertwining with other things. So I'm not so sure. I think yes, as an engineer, that can be useful. It can be kind of a rule of thumb, but it's not a strong theory if it doesn't come with a strong underlying explanation of how things work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just note that in the history of our attempts to come up with truth, true theories of things, the history of humanity is pretty spotty. Like we latch onto something and we believe that it's true, like the luminiferous ether. And then it's so true that we find excuses to dismiss any awkward anomalous data. And
Yeah, but
so,
that's the normal growth of knowledge. I mean, luminous ether was not a great theory, but it was better than whatever came before it, which might have been like, oh, we're just in the fist of some big sea god, Neptune, and whatever else came before it. So all theories are just temporary holds in the truth until
I
we find the
disagree.
next one that's better.
I don't,
What
it
theory is
wasn't
permanent?
it
What theory
wasn't
is
better.
settled?
It wasn't better because it was worse, because it created this cultural baggage that people then were unable to escape from until an outsider came. And so I kind of think that to keep ourselves fluid and, the causality around something like human cognition is just way more hairy, way more multi-causal. You've got compounding loops where stuff doesn't look like it's happening and then it slowly builds up and becomes the dominant phenomenon. And our minds were not designed to grok.
Well, I think we might have no good theory of human cognition. I mean, or the ones that are there are so weak that they just don't have much explanatory power yet. I
Well,
think mostly what Brett and I were talking about was about physics,
sure,
and physics
sure.
is tighter. Like it's it's fundamental reality. It's not wetware. It's not humans. Humans are messier.
Humans are,
But then again, like, I would have thought something like the theory of evolution, the theory of computation, like just the idea of a theory of computation and kind of how thinking machines think and what their boundaries are and what they can do and what they can't do and what kinds of problems are solvable, what kinds of problems aren't. I would not have even thought that as a discipline would necessarily be possible until I learned about it. We might be missing a very fundamental theory of human cognition that once we have it, we'll look back and consider all previous explanations as toys or just rules of thumb because we hadn't yet gotten to a deep and elegant theory.
I think it was.
well,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
I'm the crazy outsider who, in 10 years' time, you will look back and say, oh, that crazy lunatic who was on that stage 10 years ago, what a crazy person. Or in 10 years' time, when I say, actually, the right theory is a theory of the evolution of systems of computation, but you need to look at the structure of those systems, and it's actually quite hard to map them out because there are a whole lot of kind of selective forces at play, and so we're not good at thinking about systems, but if we write them down and carefully try and account for them, then you can actually get somewhere. So I'm the crazy outsider who claims that in fact it's not only tractable, but my colleagues and I have done it, and we've demonstrated that it's usable by building powerful situations in which people measurably problem solve and learn an order of magnitude faster than the best available alternatives. And to me, it's less about like, well, so is the theory true? I mean, it rings true because it's explaining things at the right level, the evolution of systems of computation, rather than, a theory about some literal stuff in your mind. But, systems of computation have state. And so what I can describe is your mental state, your dispositional state, which is the collection of things that you think of as beliefs, but actually they're represented a bit differently as kind of probabilistic causal models wrapped around conceptual entities, and then desires or goals or kind of homeostatic kind of triggered states, and then most of which are in your unconscious, so you're not aware of them, and then action plans which get decomposed into individual actions that are designed to kind of move us in the direction of fulfilling one or other of the many action plans that are kind of being held in your mind at any given moment. And so that kind of state, which is just like the state of all the running programs in your laptop or your iPhone, is not a simple thing. But if you describe the kind of evolution of a system of computation that has to simultaneously satisfy a whole bunch of different requirements because it was evolved to be good at doing those things, this is the one that checks out with both knowing what computation looks like and knowing what evolution produces.
I think we should keep in mind, the great 18th century physicist, inventor of basically electricity generation, electrical motors, Michael Faraday, who of course said, he was a great fallibilist himself, and said, I hold my theories on the very tips of my fingers, such that the smallest breath of air will blow them away. And I think a lot of great scientists over the years have thought along the same lines. They kind of want to be shown to be wrong, and they don't hold their theories to be absolutely true in any final sense. They're conjectural, they're their best guess at the time. And so what we're after correcting errors. We're trying to find the flaws in the current theories that we have. We should expect almost everything we know to ultimately, in the final analysis, to turn out to be false. That's not to say that everything is equally false. Some things contain more truth than others. Some theories solve more problems than others. But ultimately, this search for the final truth, I think it's a fool's errand. What we need instead is to improve the current theories that we have. Talking about the distinction as well, I might have to go after this, the distinction between predictive theories, purely predictive theories, and explanatory theories. We only need to move away from fundamental physics into any other domain. And one of my favourite examples, one of David's favourite examples, is the idea of dinosaurs. Now, if you think that science is merely about trying to predict stuff, well, if you want to try and explain what's going on with fossils and you're merely a predictive person, what you will say is, well, this fossil is in that strata of rock rather than this strata of rock. That particular pattern that kind of looks like a T-Rex, that's going to be found here below this thing that's a brachiosaur. But none of these things really exist, or did exist in the past. We merely are all about, us people who are paleontologists, what we're actually about is finding patterns in rock. After all, that's what fossils are. Now, that would be a ludicrous way for paleontology to be done. In fact, what paleontologists do is give us an explanation, a narrative, an account of what the reasons why those patterns in the rock, called fossils, have appeared where they appear. And they give these wonderfully exciting, thrilling stories about how these carnivorous dinosaurs really did walk the earth 100 million years ago, and they really were chasing one another. And we end up with movies like Jurassic Park that sort of try to capture what these creatures must have been like. So the explanation, not prediction, the explanation of what was going on in the past comes down to postulating entities that really existed. We're not merely about predicting what particular rocks look like and what strata these fossils apparently appear in. But of course, if we change the topic to something a little more esoteric, like fundamental physics, then you do hear certain physicists talk in terms of, well, I just want to predict the outcome of experiments. I'm not really interested in what's actually going on, what the truth of the matter is. I don't need an explanation. I don't need an interpretation. I just need to be able to crank through the equations. This is called the shut up and calculate way of doing physics. But I think that misses the point of the richness of science. The richness of science is trying to explain what is really going on, what the physical reality that we occupy actually happens to be. And it's only then, in truth, that we can actually come up with these predictions in the ultimate, in the final analysis anyway.
Every child who becomes a scientist becomes one because of their sense of wonder, because they're trying to answer the question of why is the sky blue, or why does the sun rise in the morning, not because they want to calculate these things precisely, but because they want the explanation. And that's just how we're built as human beings, because the explanations are useful. That's how we make sense of the world. That's how we build our models of how the world works. That's how we function in the world. That's how we play in the world. And the sense of wonder is intrinsically linked with both our survival as well as our creativity as well as our quest for good science. So anyway, thank you, Brett. Thank you, Shaun. I gotta go. It's pretty late over here. Brett, thanks for joining us last second. Shaun, thanks for just getting dragged up by Paul and being a good sport,
Thanks a
bearing
lot,
with us through
Nazar.
this.
Thanks, Shaun.
Thanks
See you later.
everyone for a
Great
very
fun.
esoteric and technical conversation. Have a great night.
Good night.
Good night.